Hello there and welcome to IndustryBroadcast.com's audio article number 65, made possible as always by IndustryBroadcast.com, bringing the collective insight of the gaming industry to your ears. Article number 65 was written by Daniel Cook, and now while Mr. Cook's elusive connections to the poultry industry remain a mystery to this day, there is one thing that is no secret, and that is that he is one of the great designers of our time. Daniel's roots go back to Epic Mega Games, where his first job was working on a shooter called Tyrion, but now he spends most of his days designing games deep within the forests of the Northwest. For the latest insight from Daniel Cook, we recommend that you check out his blog by going to www.lostgarden.com. Now, due to the ginormous size of today's audio article, I'll be splitting it up into two parts, so without further ado, I bring you Part A of audio article number 65, Constructing Artificial Emotions, a Design Experiment, written by Daniel Cook, and read aloud by Ryan Wienko on the 25th of January, 2009. Bacchus, the orgiastic ritual game. Now, Bacchus is a multiplayer dancing game with a religious theme. The selling point is its ability to evoke intense emotions. Imagine, if you will, a decrepit theater filled with writhing, dancing people. The lights flare and swoop in time, and people chant in unison. A massive screen shows a mirror image of the hall like some surrealistic portal into an alternate universe. Instead of blokes and lasses in street clothes, the on-screen spirits are clad in ornate ritualistic garb. The movements on each side of the screen are eerily synchronized. The pitch of the chants rises. The screen zooms in on a girl in the center of the room. The crowd as one turns and watches her figure on the screen. She begins to dance. At first her movement is controlled and intricate. The screen pulsates and she yells to the beat. The room takes up her words and amplifies them, giving them godlike resonance. Bass mixed with reverb, mixed with primal guttural passion. Her dance becomes wild. The pace increases and she begins to confess. The theater reacts. Each word she utters shimmers on the screen, merging with ghostly photos from her past. In a beat, the entire room witnesses her sorrow over the death of her mother, her time alone in an empty apartment, and her first kiss. An inhumanly beautiful electronic chorus rises, matches and turns her words into a song. Her movements become a blur. Her glowing eyes are ecstatic. At the peak, her spirit on the large screen explodes in light, and the girl collapses to the floor in fervent religious swoon. The crowd goes wild, the screen zooms out, and the next god dancer is chosen. Later, the girl writes to her online friends that the night she danced was the single most powerful spiritual and emotional experience in her entire life. It was the night she was touched by a higher power while playing a video game. Bacchus, the Gedanken Experiment. The game Bacchus is a thought experiment, not a real game. It exists merely to explore, in one design, several effective, yet rarely used techniques for inducing emotion through gameplay. It happens to have a religious theme, but I'm primarily interested in exploring how designed experiences can yield intense player emotion. The game's designer's palette of emotion has traditionally been limited to boredom, frustration, and triumphant mastery. There is very little published research on how to evoke a broader range of emotions, and designers have very few practical and theoretical tools at their disposal in the quest to create meaningful emotional experiences for their players. Designers interested in evoking emotions fall back on either A, stealing techniques from non-game media, and then we show a movie of faithful heroine being stabbed by the evil villain, or 2, copious handwriting. "See this pink pulsating blob representing feelings," explains the designer to the confused player. The resulting experiences are far more emotionally simplistic than we might dream of creating. To expand beyond the player constraints, I set forth a personal challenge. What if you wanted to create a game that pushes the player through a sequence of emotions from joy to sorrow to perhaps even religious ecstasy? What current or future techniques would you use? Is it even possible for a game to evoke such a rich palette of emotions? In order to build a game that induces such complex emotional spectrum, we need to dig into the fundamentals of evoking emotions in games. As it happens, it turns out that many folks in the scientific community have been studying tangentially related problems for quite some time. So what's covered in this essay? This essay has 5 parts. Two-factor theory of emotion. First, we'll look at the psychology behind our emotions. I'll lean on this to explore 4 pragmatic techniques that are demonstrated in Bacchus. Technique 1. Tapping existing emotional memories. Technique 2. Using relevant stimuli in order to evoke an emotional response. Technique 3. Biofeedback for controlling physical states. And Technique 4. Social norm setting for seeding appropriate cognitive labels. With each technique, we'll cover the theory, how you can put the theory to use, how technology can help, and some of the limitations. The two-factor theory of emotion. Let's begin with some basic cognitive science. The framework I'll be leaning on throughout our investigation of artificial emotions is a well-known cognitive theory called the two-factor theory of emotion. By psychologists Stanley Schachter and Jerome Singer, the theory states that in order for an emotion to be felt, 2 factors must be present. First being physiological change, the person feels an elevated heart rate, sweaty skin, and other elements of physiological arousal, and also cognitive label of physiological change. Based off the context of this situation, the person assigns a label to the physiological changes taking place. Simply put, when your body reacts physically to some stimuli and your mind assigns meaning to your physical state, you synthesize an emotional response. An intriguing experiment. The two-factor theory of emotion is certainly mildly intriguing as an analytic description of how emotion works, but it has far more practical applications in the realm of game design. In the process of proving their theories on emotion, researchers spent much of their effort on figuring out how to dissect the component aspects of emotion and reassemble them into new emotions of their choice. In effect, they figured out how to reconstitute artificial emotions within their subjects. Their experiments provide us with a practical example of how we might build our own systems of generating artificial emotions in our players. It turns out that the physiological change that accompanies many emotions, such as fear and lust, are remarkably the same. There is a wide range of stimuli, including loud noises, intense memories, or even the fear of heights, that activate a sympathetic nervous system, prepping your body for action in the face of stress. Your heart rate elevates, your palms become sweaty, your alertness increases, and your body hair stands on end. Different stimuli, same response. Due to the ambiguity of the physical response, you rely on your brain to determine what all this activity actually means. Should you run? Should you fight? Should you laugh? In a heartbeat, your brain needs to figure out what is happening and synthesize the correct response. In this moment, your carefully calibrated gray matter can be tricked. One of the colorful experiments that demonstrates this effect was performed by psychologists Dutton and Aaron in 1974. They wanted to see if they could alter the context of a situation so that the subject would instead experience lust instead of fear. In their study, a highly attractive young woman approached a sample of young men and asked them to fill out a survey. The experiment had 2 components: inducing the appropriate physiological response. 2 survey situations were tested. The first was a safe location on a trail. The second was a midpoint of a very narrow bridge overlooking a deep crevasse. Researchers knew that merely standing on the bridge elevated the heart rate and caused anxiety. Standing on the path induced no anxiety. The second component was setting the desired cognitive label. At the end of the survey, the woman passed each young man her phone number and encouraged them to give her a call if they had any further questions. Almost twice as many men, 60%, gave the girl a call if they had been surveyed on the dangerous bridge rather than the safe path. Due to the strong contextual signals in the form of the presence of an attractive woman, the men misinterpreted the fear-driven activation of their sympathetic nervous systems as authentic lust. A potion for emotion. Other experiments validated the theory by inducing both happiness and anger in their subjects. These studies suggested the following general recipe for concocting artificial emotions. Physiological responses plus cognitive labels equals emotion. Inducing the appropriate physiological response. Put the player's bodies in the appropriate physical state associated with the desired emotion through any means necessary. Setting the desired cognitive label. Provide strong contextual clues that make the user misinterpret the physical sensation as the designed emotion. By evoking both states in the player, the mental and the physical, designers can greatly increase the likelihood that players will experience the desired emotional response to a game. With our theory in hand, let's look at a set of practical techniques that helps us generate the artificial emotions at the heart of Bacchus. Technique 1. Active recall of emotional memories. How active recall builds emotions. Physiological responses. The body responds to a recall of emotional memories, plus cognitive labels. Memories contain strong emotional context equals emotion. Each word she utters shimmers on the screen, merging with ghostly photos from her past. In a beat, the entire room witnesses her sorrow over the death of her mother, her time alone in an empty apartment, and her first kiss. In Bacchus, the player recalls intensely personal emotional moments as part of a public confession. It turns out that this is a great technique for evoking both a physiological response and a set of cognitive labels. Theory. When you experience an intense emotion, a primitive portion of the brain called the amygdala kicks in and ensures that you store a vivid, emotionally charged memory. When you recall this memory, your brain also ensures that you remember the emotional element. For example, an initial experience of someone experiencing their first kiss. The body is strongly aroused, and the context is obvious. The memory is stored in a network, separate nodes for emotions, sounds, smells, colors, tactile senses, and others. Remembering an emotional event causes you to re-experience that associated emotion. One way of remembering emotional events is unaided recall. The person attempts to recall the memory. With no outside aid, the person is able to remember a few key details, perhaps the tactile sensations and the smells, perhaps the sounds and the emotions, or a fuzzy memory is recalled. The resulting memory is a rough, synthesized version of the original experience. Some elements may be exaggerated or lost. The body is unlikely to become aroused, and the context is obvious. The recollection of an emotional memory triggers the recall of the emotions associated with the event. This in turn activates the physical reactions associated with the memory. You understand what the physical reactions mean in context of the memory and the labels you have assigned to the emotions within. You experience that emotion. For example, when war vets recall a traumatic experience, they often experience elevated heart rates, perspiration, and other signs of panic. The memory of the veteran's traumatic experience triggers a replica of the physiological response that occurred during the event. The emotional panic they feel is very real, very physical, and easily measured. Other extreme examples of this phenomenon include many phobias, such as a fear of small places, flying, etc., all of which are typically rooted in some traumatic experience. The basic system of recording and recalling emotional memories that underlie these reactions is present in every single one of us. In normal circumstances, the recall of emotional memories is a healthy and helpful aspect of basic human cognition. Storing emotions in good and bad times and then recalling them instantaneously if a similar situation occurs is a great evolutionary benefit. When you see the mountain lion the second time around, your body is instantly primed for flight. You don't have to think or analyze the situation. You simply feel the correct course of action. The upside of all those millions of years of evolution for game developers? Well, your players have spent their lives collecting a deep pool of strong emotional memories that is just waiting for you to tap into with the appropriate game design. Technology. In Bacchus, the confession is a game mechanic that encourages the players to tap into their emotional memories. Confessions are effective because the player self-selects memories from the strongest, most pertinent emotional content and voluntarily shares them. For most people, this has the effect of turning on an emotional fire hose. In order to make the recall as intense as possible, we want to augment the verbal recall with a few simple technologies. Human memory is stored like a parsed set of data points in a connected network. When a person remembers, they poll on related data points to flesh out the memory. You can increase the recall by feeding the player related data points, thus lighting up more bits of their memory and increasing the clarity of the final result. Aided recall has 3 steps. Stimuli associated with the original experience. You replicate various elements of the experience and show them to the person. Be sure to emphasize sound, smells, and kinesthetic elements, not just the visuals. Number 2, the person attempts to recall the memory. With rich aids that emphasize the entire spectrum of the experience, the person is able to remember most of the key details. And lastly, the richer memory is recalled. The person recreates the experience of their first kiss, the body is strongly aroused, and the context is obvious. The classic example is a group of people remembering an event. A single person might remember a few key elements and have fuzzy memories of the event. However, when a group of people gets together, each one contributes a small piece of additional information that helps light up a healthy, detailed map of the memory. Technology can serve a similar role. Voice recognition. Publicly stating the confession allows voice recognition software to turn phrases into something the computer can understand. A database of tagged photos. In the next 20 or 30 years, it is easy to imagine that many younger people will have lived a highly documented life. An individual will be associated with a massive archive of thousands of photos, videos, and electronic messages that track almost any important aspect of their emotional and social life. A free-form associated algorithm. Once we have a list of what the person is saying, we can start pulling up pictures and reference people, places, and key times. When players view pertinent images, additional neural pathways are triggered that ideally enhance and clarify the recall of the memory associated with the confession. The result of this particular system is the intense recall of a very personal memory. With intense recall comes a highly desirable, stronger physiological reaction. The benefits. The main benefits of using the recall of personal emotion is that you are almost always going to get a solid emotional response, especially in newer players. You are digging up the raw material of their most personal emotions, and the results can be explosive. Limitations. The downside of using emotional memories to generate physiological responses are substantial. Responses tend to be context-specific. The subject activates numerous cognitive labels in the process of activating the memories. When you are feeling sad about the death of your first dog, it can be hard to transfer those feelings to another topic. This can cloud any authorial intent on the part of the game designer when they try to introduce their own labels into the game. They become less powerful upon a repeated recall. If emotional memories are recalled in safe environments, they start losing their emotional power. The brain learns that maybe it isn't worth getting all worked up about, and it's a false alarm. Many therapists use this fact to decondition those phobias, but it becomes problematic for repeat players who are actively seeking the jolt that comes from the recall. Risk of trauma. Some players have several psychological issues that are exacerbated by free-form recall. Games that make people cry aren't always healthy for the players that have serious issues to cry about. Technique 2. Evoking emotional memories with relevant stimuli. How relevant stimuli builds emotions. The physiological response, the body responds to a partial recall of emotional memories, plus cognitive labels. Symbolicism, not memories, suggests context, equals emotion. The on-screen spirits are clad in ornate ritualistic garb. The room takes up her words and amplifies them, giving them godlike resonance. Bass mixed with reverb, mixed with primal, guttural passion. An inhumanly beautiful electronic chorus rises, matches, and turns her words into song. Her movements become a blur. Her glowing eyes are ecstatic. At the peak, her spirit on the large screen explodes in light. In Bacchus, the player is surrounded by rich, evocative visuals and symbols. These also play an important role in priming the player to feel emotion. This technique builds upon some of the elements of emotional memories, but uses relevant stimuli instead of the blunt trauma of the actual recall. We broadly evoke the player's existing experiences with religion. Theory. Once upon a time, I had a workmate that had an irrational fear of houseplants. When she was a child, her aunt played tag with her in the greenhouse. At some point, the game stopped being a game. The girl desperately wanted the aunt to stop, but the aunt assumed the girl was still playing. The intense emotional memory of being hunted, terrified, and surrounded by clinging, suffocated plants was searing into my workmate's memory. This is in keeping with our discussion of emotional memories. What I found fascinating is that recalling the specific event was not the only trigger for her phobia. Instead, stimuli peripherally connected with the memory, such as a particular shade of green, a swaying vine, or a delivery of flowers with a bit too much leafy foliage on Valentine's Day, could set off a panic attack. We call this relevant stimuli. We use universally evocative stimuli, build up a rich and detailed convincing experience. and the shotgun of the stimuli will light up some of the nodes. With rich aids that emphasize the entire spectrum of the experience, the person is able to remember most key details. And lastly, a mental image is synthesized. The result is a patchwork of previous experiences that includes emotional memories. The body is mildly aroused, and the context is seen as fictional. Emotional memories need not be triggered by recalling the exact event that embedded them. Instead, rich, contextually coherent descriptions of similar situations can trigger those same pathways, though perhaps to a lesser degree. You may feel joy when you remember your first kiss with that shy girl from next door, but you may also feel joy if you hear the story of someone much like you who kisses the shy young princess. Enough nodes in your memory are triggered for you to react to the related story. There is a rather broad cognitive theory of media at play here. In short, the contents of media, be they sounds, images, physical or social situations, inevitably intersect with rich existing palettes of emotional memories found within almost any human being. In order to process new stimuli, we tap into our memories and experiences relevant to the new experience. The nodes associated with intense emotional memories given priority during the act of recall, since they are likely to contain the most relevant information to survival. An image of a hammer is much more likely to generate the recall of that time you drove a nail through your thumb than the 1,000 previous nails you had pounded successfully. The result is a real emotional response to the stimuli, even though we may not be able to consciously make the connection with the original memory. It can be a strange concept to wrap your head around. When you read a romantic book, your response is as much due to your past experience with romance as it is to the contents of the book. It is very likely that another person who has led an unnaturally lonely life might read the same book and not be moved at all. As a traditional author, your goal is to describe experiences that are relevant or highly correlated with the experiences that your audience might possess. This is one very powerful technique for creating meaningful, emotional, impactful media, but this isn't anything new. Much of what game artists and writers do involves the creation of relevant stimuli. All of those detailed graphics, booming sound effects, and cliché storylines, well, that's relevant stimuli, baby. Technology. According to our little theory, the building up on lessons of emotional memories, you can predict the characteristics of highly effective relevant stimuli. Detailed. The more detailed you can be, the more likely you'll light up a rich network of nodes. Personal. The more you can get someone to empathize with an experience, the more likely they'll link it to their own personal memories. Bacchus doesn't rely on a plot or well-rounded NPCs for its relevant stimuli. Instead, it focuses on making the fantastical spiritual experience in the game personally relevant and highly detailed. The detail comes in the form of traditional imagery and sound effects that reference common cultural relevant spiritual symbols. The ornate costumes worn by the player avatars are intentionally laden with various religious icons, glowing colors, angel wings, etc. The choral sounds are intended to recall childhood experiences with church choirs, or even popular culture representations of spirituality found in movies or on television. Movies and books are typically limited to piling on the detail and hoping that it strikes a chord. Games, however, have the opportunity to make all these details much more personal and relevant to the moment at hand. The primary technique that you see in Bacchus is known as avatar mapping, where the player's actions are mapped onto an in-game character. It stops being about watching a costumed religious icon and more about interacting and participating on a personal level with a religious situation. Capturing movement data. In the next 20 years, it should be feasible to build high dynamic range digital cameras that take crisp 20 megapixel shots at high frame rates. Add in high range finding technology, a beefy processor, and some multi-person image processing software, and you have a system capable of tracking the subtle movements of an entire crowd in real time. Simple versions of this are already happening with a hardware like the iToy or the Nintendo Wiimote. Mapping movements onto an avatar. All this detailed movement information can be mapped onto a 3D model in real time. This technology exists today and will only get better. Voice mapping. Just as your visuals can be altered, so can your voice. When 100 people yell out the same phrase in a crowded room full of pumping noise, the computer isolates a single voice. That single voice is converted into text, timing, inflections, emphasis, and volume information. It is broken down in its components and reconstituted. If an old man wishes to sound like a young boy, a middle-aged woman, or a monster ripped from studios of Hollywood. All this takes is the flip of a digital switch. You talk, and someone else instantly says your words. All of this, of course, is a crapshoot. If I'm lucky, I'll actually trigger the recall of an actual spiritual experience. The benefits. The use of related stimuli is the gold standard for inducing artificial emotions across practically every media known to man. Great novels, paintings, movies, and poems rely on their intense portrayals of a human experience that is not our own, but close enough to tap into our personal experiences. As a creator, this is a technique that is quite cost-effective, and most of us have been trained in its application. You can craft a single static experience that is broadly applicable to your audience. You don't have to worry about customizing your message. They'll expend the effort to find the meaning. You can rely on your own personal experience for inspiration. This isn't because you are special. Instead, it is because whatever you come up with will likely be close enough to what someone else has experienced. Humans are limited in what they can experience. If you describe how you are feeling when you are sad or happy, you are also likely describing how others are feeling when they experience those same emotions. This greatly reduces the need for detailed customer feedback, an expensive activity. You can be sloppy. Relevant stimuli is like using a shotgun. Whatever you make is likely to be meaningful to someone in the audience. A wide range of modern art and music plays on this loophole by showering people with ambiguous messages. A small percentage gets it, and that is enough to pay the bills. Setting the cognitive labels. If all else fails, relevant stimuli can still at least set up the appropriate context for interpreting the experience. If the player doesn't tap into existing spiritual experiences, they at least understand from the overload of religious symbols that they participated in some sort of religiously themed activity. Limitations. Relevant stimuli is amazingly powerful, but it has some limitations when it comes to use in games. High burnout. After a very short period of exposure, the player starts ignoring relevant stimuli. Techniques such as avatar mapping and other user-generated content strategies can help keep content fresher, but replacing consumed content is still a costly issue to consider. Limited interactivity. Traditional forms of relevant stimuli do not change with the user's input. Movies, narratives, and images are all about evoking a response, but they have no ability to adapt once the player responds. Unpredictable. It is hard to guarantee that relevant stimuli will produce the desired emotional response. Look at the case of Harry Potter. Most saw the first book as a charming schoolboy romp and identified with its stimuli targeting their own feelings of adventure, mystery, and coming of age. Others saw it as an obvious promotion of witchcraft and Satanism. They reacted with anger and fear. What your audience brings to the work has a huge impact on how it is interpreted. This concludes Part A of audio article number 65. The second half of this article will be on IndustryBroadcast.com tomorrow, so make sure to check back to the site then. Once again, this article was written by Daniel Cook, whose blog can be found at www.lostgarden.com. And of course, it was brought to you by